Hi there, Megan Thompson with Megan Thompson Coaching, and today we're going to cover the difference between ADHD and the highly sensitive personality trait, also known as sensory processing sensitivity. So if you're parenting a highly sensitive child or a kiddo who feels big feelings, and this is a child or a teenager, we'll cover that in a minute, related to, what you're noticing is that their behavior is focused on big, major outbursts, explosive behavior, destructive behavior, aggressive behavior like hitting, kicking, screaming, throwing things, running away, or meltdowns when it comes down to tasks required of them like chores or homework. And you're wondering whether or not those meltdowns are caused by the highly sensitive trait and being stuck in the meltdown cycle, or if your child has ADHD, in terms of, maybe you've read something on the internet about how kids with ADHD can also have big behavioral outbursts, then today is your lucky day. We're going to cover all of the things related to that, and as much as we can in today's show. And so make sure that you stick around, and let's get started. The first thing that I want to cover is, how do I know what I'm talking about, right? I'm a parent coach and consultant, mental health consultant, and I've been working in the mental health field outside of my master's degree, post-master's degree, for over a decade. And with that being said, it's really important that you know more about my expertise, right? And I don't cover that every show because that would be redundant. What you've heard me say, and if you've listened to more than one show, is that we help parents of highly sensitive kids and teens eliminate the meltdown or shutdown cycle that is happening in their homes daily, multiple times a day, multiple times a week. Okay, so that frequency is our specialty. Now, with that being said, we help parents do this with their children who are in early elementary, pre-K, all the way through elementary age, middle school age, just by working with the parents alone. And we can break out of this cycle with our clients. We do that in as little as 8 weeks. And then with the parents that we work with and their teenagers, we also work with teenagers. And that's a combined service, teens and parents together, in the work that we do with teens. And those teens are typically isolating, shutting down, refusing to get work done, and procrastination is typically relevant here, which might be a buzzword for you if you're looking up whether or not your child or your teen fits the criteria for ADHD, and whether or not you're in the right place here with following what we have to say here at MTC. And those teens are typically, the behaviors that parents are looking to address are refusals, isolation, procrastination, just staying in their room, shutting down, etc. So we help parents and teens together eliminate that cycle as well. And so the important component that we're going to cover today is the fact that we've helped hundreds of families do this around the world through the coaching work that we do at MTC. And it's also true that before I started MTC for several years ago, I had been doing this in a private practice, and I still run that private practice, though I have clinicians who work for me at this point. And they're doing more of the direct service work than I am, because my direct service is focused in our coaching company. Those are two separate companies. So since you're finding me through this company, I don't talk about the other company a lot because people can get confused. Transformational coaching is completely different in terms of its service provision than mental health therapy. And so it's really important that not only do I keep both companies separate so people don't get confused, but also that you understand that the timeline is different in terms of how swiftly we can help parents break out of this pattern when you're fit for coaching. And that timeline is obviously not relevant when children that we work with in our mental health private practice are engaging in active suicidal actions, taking action on those suicidal thoughts, and in and out of the hospital by the time they come to us, or we're working to keep them out of the hospital in the first place. They might have been to multiple therapists before they came to our door. And that's our specialty in the mental health private practice. So we'll cover a little bit about that today, because when we think about the distinction of ADHD and a personality trait like sensory processing sensitivity, it's really important that you know your information is coming from a professional. Okay, so let's roll down resume lane today. Okay, let's give my my quiet LinkedIn profile a little bit of life today in the show. Okay, so that was a joke because I'm not often on LinkedIn, but okay. So first things first. Some of you might know that personally. My sister's highly sensitive, so I'm 2 years older than her, which means my whole conscious life, memory conscious life, has included a highly sensitive family member. Okay, and though we didn't know my sister was highly sensitive, we did identify her as more of a black sheep in the sense of not really understanding her needs, and there was chronic invalidation in the home for my sister's big emotions, because the rest of us are not highly sensitive, and my parents were doing the best they could, but they just simply didn't know, and they used traditional parenting strategies like timeouts and punishments and lectures and shaming and soap in the mouth and spankings occasionally. And that was like way better than how they were raised. And so they were trying to level up there. But it's all they knew. We were parented in the 80s, and, the information on effective parenting and helping parents, build effective, emotionally sound and safe relationships was just simply not around. I mean, my mom read Dr. Green's The Explosive Child, when my sister was young. And I remember reading it in high school because I was interested in the field at that point. But that didn't shift the paradigm in my family. So we have the personal experience, right? That's important. But then when we think about my professional experience, that started when I was a senior in high school. I started my focus on working in the mental health field. Earlier than that, I was mentored and had conversations through the community with other social workers in the area, and through either my church or through my mom's relationships, because my mom worked in the school systems. And so I was able to speak with people. I wanted to initially be a lawyer, but work in the juvenile justice system. But what I noticed is that I actually wanted to get out ahead of that. So I spoke with different people in the community who worked in the mental health field, and was able to arrange my first internship through a program in my high school. And that internship was at a residential treatment facility, one of the only ones in the state of Massachusetts, who worked with young children. So these are kids who are 5, 6, 7, removed from their homes, either because of their big, intense emotional experiences. Their outbursts were out of control to the point where the professionals involved in their lives, as well as their family members, had noticed their behavior could not keep them safe in their homes. Okay, it's also true that some of the children were victims of significant abuse, and so those children were removed from their homes for their own safety, and their behavior played out their trauma. Right, if you're abused, you're going to get aggressive in most circumstances, or you'll start to hurt yourself in other circumstances. And so when we think about that intensity, I witnessed that intensity at an early age in my professional career, because for me, and just the way that I'm built, I knew what I was going to do in high school, and that didn't change. Like I still do, I still work with kids with big explosive behaviors, coming up on 20 years later at this point, the time of the recording of this show. So I'm pretty decisive, and I know what I want, so I get it early. And that's just been something that I've been able to have, the blessings and privileges in my life to have achieved and arranged early. And with that being said, my other experiences in direct service at extreme levels of service, noticing kids with pretty extreme behaviors, I've had internships in juvenile detention centers. I've worked in residential treatment centers. This is something that you guys have probably heard me speak about more regularly, where those children, adolescents, were removed from their homes because of the safety issue as well, but they were older. They were middle school, high school aged, and these children were either raised in invalidating homes, in the sense that their parents just simply didn't understand them, and they were highly sensitive, and their behavior got so extreme to the point where they were chronically suicidal, self-harming consistently, and parents just couldn't keep them safe in their homes, and they were in and out of the hospital, so much so that they were removed into a residential treatment center, 6 months to a year placement. Or these children were also abused, and their behavior became so intense that they were removed, and they needed a different place to live that was in a locked door facility. And then the other side of that, in the same facility, we also worked with teenagers who had a juvenile offense record. And so these kids got in trouble with the law, but the state, the professionals in the state had noticed that the cause of their ineffective behavior, unlawful behavior, was because of their mental health issues. So they were put in a position to receive mental health treatment, while they also had a Department of Justice record. And so to say I've been exposed to the gamut is a little bit of an understatement, because I've also worked in outpatient and community mental health settings as well, prior to starting my own companies and running my own practice and coaching company as well. So I've worked with families also who have, outside of those, where the children were removed from the homes and placed in and out of the home placement. I've also worked with children before they got to that point, refugees, because I worked outside of DC. So these are children who have escaped gang-torn countries, war-torn countries, and there's a really big refugee population in DC, and then also children and families who are underserved with a lower socioeconomic status, and the county government that I worked for at that point. We served that population, high Spanish-speaking population, as well as Middle Eastern population. And so when we think about the needs of families who are coming from war-torn countries, there's an obvious significant amount of trauma that the families have experienced, to include domestic violence, physical abuse in the home of the children, in terms of, as well as sexual abuse or other emotional abuse trauma that I treated, and as a therapist. And then also we worked with the families directly to support them in breaking out of those patterns more effectively. And some of the children engaged in such significant behaviors that they weren't able to maintain the care at receiving the care in an outpatient setting. So I was involved in them being referred to a higher level of care, to include hospital or residential care. And so when we think about my experience in all of this, my training was really a key component to this. So again, just blessed with the level of expertise of the professionals that I worked for in that setting. They were, my supervisors were, they were just diamonds in the rough, man. Like, the team that I ended up on had like the biggest heart and the biggest level of dedication to really excellent care for these families that we served, and focus on true to the research, evidence-based work, and understanding how children experience the world through play and communication, as the core need for ineffective behavior was something that I learned throughout my entire mental health professional experience. And I was privileged enough to work with such a phenomenal organization that I was trained by published authors. Train the trainer training, where I was mentored for many years by really, really significant people in the field of child play therapy, of trauma focused care. And so, as much as that's irrelevant for me and my expertise, what's important for you to know is that I've experienced and worked with successfully children who have experienced meltdowns due to trauma, children who have experienced meltdowns due to ADHD, children who have experienced meltdowns due to growing up in an invalidating environment where it's purely a mismatched parenting experience, and they're highly sensitive. And so that's been my whole entire career. It's pretty effective and easy for me to notice the difference in what's leading to these, what's leading to the meltdowns. And this is why you're here, because the way that we write here at MTC, the way that I communicate our expertise, the way that I describe the problem that you're having, that's all based on my experience of the highly sensitive meltdown cycle compared to the ADHD meltdown or outburst patterns that you might see, or the trauma meltdown cycle. And so when we think about the challenges that you're seeing, if you've resonated with what we have to say, there's a very high likelihood that your kid's highly sensitive, even if you don't think they check all the boxes. But we're going to cover this today because this is tricky, right? I mean, I'm not going to give you a master's degree in a 45-minute or less, I don't know how long I'll talk today, show. And nor, let alone, download my entire decades plus, if you want to talk pre-masters, 2 decades plus years of experience in this field. So, I'm going to speak in a way that helps you understand you're in the right place, or decide you're not, and get that clarity today. So that's the objective of today's training. And so we think about the importance of understanding, and this is just for, are my kids' meltdowns due to an ADHD diagnosis that's unmet, or is my kid diagnosed with ADHD and maybe I need to rethink that and ask whether or not the professional who has diagnosed my kid with ADHD is familiar with the personality trait in a way that they can understand the difference. Or, is my child actually highly sensitive? And the layperson's or mommy bloggers, or Pinterest infographics that I've been learning from, or general professionals, right? So there might be other consultants, parenting experts that you're following who have more of a wide range of expertise, perhaps, that's hard to say. They have more of a wide range of scope in the sense that they are more generally knowledgeable of different pockets of mental health needs and temperament needs, but without the specialty, right? Because I just kind of corrected myself, because generalist to everyone means that you are going to be a specialist to none. So when we think about the important components to this, my job here for you is to help you find that certainty in understanding the differentiation between ADHD and the highly sensitive personality trait. The first thing that we need to notice is that these two are not mutually exclusive. That means that a child can meet the criteria for ADHD, okay, diagnostic criteria, be neurodivergent in that way, in this thinking process, in the way that their brain operates, and also be highly sensitive. Because being highly sensitive is a personality trait, much like introversion or extroversion or type A, which is a fad, but a layperson perspective, but somebody who is outcome driven, a little perfectionistic maybe, and detail oriented. You might consider yourself to be a type A person, right? That's a pretty widespread term in personality traits. And then whereas type B might be more laid back, more somebody who tends to follow rather than lead. And these are generalizations because that's not the purpose of today's conversation, but I'm just trying to give you the context of different personality traits, right? So being highly sensitive does not mean that you're an introvert, doesn't mean that you're an extrovert either. Because 30% of highly sensitive people are extroverts. So those two things do not go hand in hand either. And it's also true that being highly sensitive and having this way of operating in your brain, the way that your brain works, is not a mental health diagnosis. That means that a lot of mental health professionals are not clear on this specialty, on this understanding. You might have heard about it because the internet can I mean, you can contact somebody and say, my kid's highly sensitive, and 2 seconds later, your therapist can look it up before your appointment and be like, yeah, I've heard of it. Sure, absolutely, right? Because, but where's the source? Psychology Today, Mom Blog USA, right? Like, who knows, right? So we want to just observe when you're finding professionals who are learned in this topic. You need to understand what they have, what their specialty is. How have they gotten their specialty, okay? And what training have they been trained on, and how have they been trained? And that is something that you can certainly look up and ask about. And again, like I said, I just kind of gave you a high level overview of my experience, my expertise, and you can find other ways to look that up if you want more information from me about that, or reach out, or like I said, I have a LinkedIn profile. So either way, that's neither here nor there. The focus on communicating this at this point is in understanding the difference. Okay, now, last caveat here, I'm not here to diagnose your kid. I have not clinically assessed your kid. I'm not operating through this show as a therapist at all. I'm not using my license to tell you what I know. I'm using my professional experience that happens to have been focused in the mental health field for, like I said, over almost 2 decades, and professionally from a master's degree standpoint for over a decade, half of that time. And with that being said, the focus for what we're doing here, if you're a parent who wants to break out of the meltdown shutdown cycle with your child or teen, you need to understand where those meltdowns are stemming from. Enough to know that you're in the right place, not enough to understand how to break it down, because quite frankly, that requires a lot of professional experience that many parents don't have. And I'm saying that because the clients that we work with often work in the field. 70% of the families that we work with are professionals in the field. Teachers, doctors, nurses, professors, therapists, psychologists, etc. And that level of expertise doesn't mean that you will understand the trait enough to break out of the meltdown cycle yourself. So, again, let's get to the point, Meg. How does my kid have these meltdowns? Why? Where are they coming from, right? So let's understand the personality trait. Now, the highly sensitive personality trait has 4 components: depth of processing, being easily overstimulated, emotionally reactive or responsive to the environment, and highly empathetic, and then sensitive to subtleties in the environment, which may or may not be sensory subtleties. So sensory meaning touch, taste, smell, noise, etc. But it also can be emotional sensitivities, right? You've heard the whole cliche, you can cut the tension with a knife. Your highly sensitive kid picks up on that, okay? So for ADHD, there is an important component, and to break this down in a simple way, in a time-sensitive way, ADHD is an experience of neurodivergence where the person, the child, is demonstrating a gap in their behavior, in their emotional capacity, and in their academic display of performance between ability and performance. Okay, so a child might be able to do the work in, like, let's use academic framework for this. Might be able to understand the math and understand a written assignment. However, from an intellectual standpoint, but their performance does not indicate that. Okay, and the gap there between ability and performance is where we're going to look today, because the cause of that gap is different for highly sensitive kids compared to kids with ADHD. Because you guys, if you've listened to me before, you know that I have said that your child is missing skills, right? That means there's a gap there. There's a skill gap to manage their emotions. Okay, so we're going to talk about the difference in context with each other. So when we think about the skill gaps in kids with ADHD, okay, affectionately called ADHDers by the more modern providers and professionals, as well as people with ADHD themselves. Typically, adults with ADHD prefer identity first language, which means I'm a person with ADHD. Sometimes adults prefer their neurodivergent first language, which is I'm an ADHDer, and so there's two different ways to refer to somebody with ADHD right now in modern language, and so I'll be using that interchangeably because yourself as a parent, when you want to educate yourself, you may or may not go label first in describing your child if you're certain that your kid fits the criteria for ADHD, and your child's identity might shift as they age with ADHD. Okay. So we want to take a clear picture of this, because there are some important pieces around the definition of performance that don't often take into account the fact that typical educational settings are not child development friendly. So I'm going to just say that first as a caveat, that today's educational systems in general, at large, expect children to sit down for 6 hours straight with very little body movement, and children who are capable of doing that are often focused in their left brain by listening to the rules, but they are not actually learning much and capable of learning much, because children need to operate in their right brain. And the right brain is creative, feeling, and doing. And the body needs to move to do that. Children communicate through play, and you can't be very playful if you're sitting down, arms crossed, legs stiff at a desk. So many children who struggle with following the rules as their primary reason for sitting down are misdiagnosed with ADHD, because adults aren't taking into account how children learn when they're trying to teach them. And so this is really, really important, because we've seen a rise in the diagnosis of ADHD, but we've also seen a pretty clear connection correlation, I should say, to a more stringent belief in the educational systems that children need to learn to sit down and write and do worksheets and follow a regimented educational plan at an earlier and earlier age. Kids being sent home in kindergarten with homework, and first grade with reading assignments, when the average child reads and learns to read between the ages of 6 and 11, and that is developmentally appropriate. And it's also true that a child's hands don't have the bones to hold a pencil. Between the ages of 5 and 7, the bone development in a hand of a child makes really significant leaps. And I know this information because we have educators on our team, also because we have OTs on our team. So I'm speaking out of the context of a mental health professional's knowledge, because I'm not speaking to you as a mental health professional, I'm speaking to you as a parent coach who's an expert in highly sensitive personality trait, who has broken out of this meltdown cycle. And quite frankly, some of those meltdowns are happening in schools where the schools aren't supporting kids in learning in a way that they learn. So we have to look at the whole body at that point. We have to look at the brain. We have to look at the body development. We have to look at how kids learn, and children learn through play. And it's not very playful to sit at a desk. So when we look at the understanding of ADHD and the definition of performance, you have to take that into context, because the concept of who's grading performance is incredibly important. You know, we work with our clients whose kids are expected to sit down, put up, and shut up, to be blunt, in a school setting, and those children are able to effectively recite, dance, and play out really effectively at home the concepts of what they're learning. But when delivered in a way to manage 25 kids, I mean, there's only one way to do that: make them all do the same thing. Because the teachers are doing the best they can, and you know, I'm not here to talk about the educational system in the sense that it's that there's a way to fix it. It's pretty broken, but the understanding at this point is noticing for kids at this in this experience, what, you know, where that definition of performance is coming from. Okay, so when we think about that performance, highly sensitive kids, or kids who fit the criteria for ADHD, or neurotypical kids, are all going to be graded with the same definition of performance within some wiggle room parameters here, right? But that performance is associated with the classroom assignments, right? Because for you as a parent, you know, unless you're homeschooling, you're not deciding what your kid should be educated on, right? And, you know, what the deadlines are on that. Those deadlines are designed based on curriculum decisions that are not often based in science. They're often based on decided metrics that beat competitors' metrics. So, you know, we're pushing kids towards adult agendas here. And so we have to name that. I'm not here to brush over that subject, but I'm also not here to like fight the man and derail the whole conversation. We have to look at this in context. Okay. So when a kiddo is struggling to digest a ton of information that's not effectively on their grade level, on their emotional and cognitive level, then when we're gauging the gap in visual and verbal and nonverbal working memory, we want to assume that the memory ability for your child is not overloaded. Okay, so we want to take that into context. Is my kid in a school setting where they are given space and patience to learn and to recall information? Okay, because that ability to recall information when stressed is going to look different than when disorganized, but the same, it's going to feel different for the child when stressed than when disorganized. But if you have a kid who's having a hard time recalling that information because it didn't come into their brain in the first place because they were either distracted, aka focused on something else, compared to if they were overwhelmed because the teacher just chastised another kid, or because a different kid was upset and they were focused on that upset kid, or because a different kid was walking around the classroom and they were worried about that kid getting in trouble. That's an emotional motivation to refocus when the child's not at task, and that can affect a child's patterns of performance as well. And those concerns about the collective community, that's more relevant for kids with the sensitive personality trait, whereas children who are focused on something of a higher interest to them, of higher motivation to them, but not really focused on other people in that environment, that might be more relevant for a child who fits criteria for ADHD. So, This is one component. This is the working memory, being able to recall information that you're working on right now. Okay, so stay on track, stay on task. You want to look at, why is my kid not staying on task? Not necessarily, can my kid stay on task? Because the understanding of how much on task your kid should be is one part. And then also, because the average child, 5, 6, 7, can sustain their attention span for about 15 to 20 minutes consistently without redirection, consistent focus. But we can look at these kids who are expected to do this work independently for half an hour, before a subject is changed, or even longer. And a younger child is being held to that task that is actually not developmentally appropriate because adults told them that it should be, without understanding the science of working memory. So then we go into, so that's one piece, okay? Can your kid perform with working memory when calm, when in a safe, effective, supportive environment? And highly sensitive kids can usually do that, and kids who fit the criteria for ADHD struggle with that. And I'm saying that because it's less of an emotional drive for that skill gap. It's more of a brain ability and brain motivation and an attention focused need. So you should be able to notice a difference when your kid is home, feeling calm, and engaging in a similar task, though not necessarily homework. Who likes homework? But perhaps an art project or just learning something on their own accord. You should be able to notice the difference there. The next category that we're going to talk about is the ability to self-regulate emotions. Kids with ADHD can struggle with regulation of their emotions. We can see impulsive behavior or hyperactive behavior in that respect, and those are more clinical terms, right? More strength-focused would be passionate behavior or intense positive emotion, right? And you can see that behavior in both highly sensitive kids and kids in ADHDers. So that wouldn't be something that I would definitively categorize as one or the other, because highly sensitive kids can demonstrate a lot of positive emotion that can get to the point where they're frenetic in their energy, and the positive emotion is just too much. And so we wouldn't look at that as a factor in discerning one or the other. We do want to look at motivation, what drives a child to be emotionally focused and motivatingly focused on their on the task at hand. And you want to look at intrinsic motivation. So this is the child's general internal drive to get the work done, to get the task done. This is related to chores. It's related to fun activities that require some work. So say, for example, painting from start to finish in a project, Legos. Sorry, guys, I grew up saying Legos. Apparently it's Lego. My kid's 5. We're not into Legos yet. But, and then I'm not looking at technological-based skills here because there's different factors. We're not going to cover that today. So I want you to focus on hands-on or body-focused activities that are either fine or gross motor. So painting, writing, coloring, etc. Lego, or completing a task from start to finish with full body. So that would be like climbing in a playground, engaging in play with other kids, and maintaining and sustaining motivation and focus for the entire activity that the kids are engaged in. So we would look at those, the sustained attention and sustained motivation to participate in those avenues, because that's more how children operate in terms of an appropriate way to assess a child. Not I sit down, do this benign task that you'll never have to do again and is really disinteresting to you. That's a much more difficult way to gauge whether or not a child is internally motivated, because the task given to them is boring or irrelevant to them. And children who are highly sensitive are more inclined to complete a test like that because they're worried about disappointing adults. Whereas children, ADHDers, kids who fit the criteria for ADHD, are going to be more inclined to focus on their own internal motivation in that, and use that to guide whether or not they should get it done or not. And that would be one factor. But we also want to look at what else helps kids complete tasks, and that is the concept of organization and multiple step direction following. And this is called reconstitution. So the concept of being able to take an end result and look at how many steps or what kinds of steps would need to be put in place and organize them from first, second, third order of business to get to the end. That brain concept is called reconstitution. And both highly sensitive kids and children who fit criteria for ADHD struggle with this, but for two different reasons, okay? Highly sensitive kids struggle with this due to emotional overwhelm. It is very hard to figure out how to get from A to Z when you're overwhelmed, right? Think about a time when you just felt like your mind was out of control and the problem that you had at hand was just too big to swallow. It was hard for you to see the forest for the trees, right? Because you were likely stuck in analysis paralysis, which is, which way do I go first? Now that's more true for people who are highly sensitive. We call this analysis paralysis, which is a response that you can also see in language focused on symptoms of anxiety. Newsflash: everyone feels anxious. Everyone feels nervous sometimes. So that's not I'm not going down the rabbit hole of like, is that a diagnosable issue? Everyone can feel anxious, but what leads to freezing in that moment is, for highly sensitive people, I want to do it right the first time. This is a highly sensitive part of the trait. Okay. The high motivation to do it right the first time is pervasive in the highly sensitive personality trait. And where people get stuck is in the emotional overwhelm of not knowing what right is, or not knowing which avenue leads them to the perfect answer. And that's where people can get stuck. And that perfectionism is a symptom, and can be a symptom of the meltdown cycle. It's a symptom of being highly sensitive without skills. And that might mean you as an adult who's highly sensitive can deal with this a lot. And we work with our clients who are parents of highly sensitive kids. Many of them are highly sensitive themselves. And we help parents break out of that overwhelm life cycle as well, because that is a symptom of the meltdown cycle that highly sensitive adults carry into adulthood, even if they've grown out of the emotional outburst meltdown cycle themselves, or just was more of an implosion experience for them when they were younger. So we see this in highly sensitive kids. And so what's important to notice, though, is that the highly sensitive kids and kids who have ADHD are going to typically give the same answer. I don't know. Let's get started. What do you want to do first? I don't know. What do you think you should do first? I don't know. But the I don't know is coming from a different place. The I don't know for highly sensitive kids is coming from, I don't know which way to go first to get me to my perfect outcome. There are 700 in my brain right now. And I can't narrow it down. And this is the difference between a non-highly sensitive person's brain whose spider web of ideas look like this, and a highly sensitive person's brain whose spider web ideas looks like this. I only have two hands, guys, and I'm using my hands to put, for those of you who are listening to this on the podcast, think about a spider web that has 5 strings of ideas compared to a spider web that has 20 strings of ideas. And that's the simple everyday experience of a highly sensitive child, which is that depth of processing component. But when coupled with overwhelm in the meltdown cycle, can go straight to, I won't do it, I can't, which is the same response you can see with a kid with ADHD. But the I can't is, I have no idea what options are. I'm sure there probably are some, but I'm having a hard time organizing my thoughts, which means I'm having a hard time noticing my thoughts. And so I can't come up with 1 or 2 or 3 options because right now my brain is feeling frozen. Okay. And that's different than there are a lot and that's freezing me, right? Which is the highly sensitive trait. So, the slowdown experience of a person with ADHD is, happens before the generation of ideas compared to the slowdown experience of a person who fits criteria for the highly sensitive trait, which is that the ideas are happening. They're always happening. Depth of processing doesn't turn off. But the flood is leading to overwhelm, and that's a nervous system overwhelm, which is, triggers fight, flight, freeze. And this is a pervasive full-bodied level of intensity coupled with the higher propensity for shame, which means that people are going to think that I am not good at this. And now I'm disappointing people and now I'm a bad kid. It goes down the rabbit hole of I'll never get to it. I'll never get it done. Might as well not even try. I'm the worst. You shouldn't even bother with me. Life would be better off without me. That's a shame spiral that happens after the I don't think I can do it right. Whereas the kids with ADHD will say, I can't do it because they're in freeze mode without the thoughts coming to their mind. So this is important because this is a concept of neurodivergence. If you're not careful, you can think of that as a deficit in the sense that that this means that kids are limited intellectually with ADHD, and that is simply not true. Their brain thinks differently, and they need different supports in place in order to reach their goals. But with that being said, kids with ADHD can surpass their peers when their lives are taught these skills. So both ways of thinking, both neurodivergent ways of thinking are completely available for high levels of potential with these children. So it's really important to understand that. Now, one of the skills I have, being not highly sensitive myself, is being able to take that information and explain it to the average layperson as parents. So I'm going to use these, use words like these children with ADHD, children who are highly sensitive. I'm not highly sensitive myself. So with that being said, having worked with hundreds of families around the world and then also hundreds of kids directly over the course of my career, I have a pretty clear sense of where both come from, and I've witnessed being able to see kids' brains operate, see kids think in different settings. I've worked in the school settings in my career as well, both in the residential school settings, but also in general public ed school settings. Where am I going here with this? I did write down notes because there's a lot of technical factors I want to make sure that I cover. So the important piece of noticing that organizing multiple step directions has a different presentation in the highly sensitive trait, and for kids with ADHD, we have to notice that some kids who are highly sensitive also fit criteria for ADHD, and that is a double whammy in this context. So this is why I'm saying, obviously, as I began today's conversation, this is something that a conversation with a professional who knows what they're doing has to be relevant, because I can give you the broad strokes of this concept, but there are a lot of nuances to these factors. Okay, I was focusing on the presentation of kids with ADHD and kids with a highly sensitive personality trait, and we want to look at the difference between those skills. And the important piece that I want to cover is that the difference in how highly sensitive kids compared to kids with ADHD perform, and that consistency in demonstrating challenged performance. And again, we're figuring out how you guys are gauging performance. That's a different topic. is important, because highly sensitive kids who are settled in their emotional experience at that point, if they have the skills or they just happen to have the environment that is calm in that one environment, they can demonstrate that performance and they can excel beyond their peers. Whereas kids with ADHD need extra supports in place to learn and to follow through on the task at hand. And that is true whether the environment is chaotic, stressful or not. Though a chaotic and stressful environment will compound a child's stress too. So you may see worse performance from a kid with ADHD in a more stressful school environment, just like you would see that from anybody. We had teachers growing up in the public school system that I went to where we knew, like, we just, as kids, we knew we just didn't want to be in their classroom because they were just terrorizing, terrifying, I should say. And children know that. Children understand that. I can tell you the name of the third grade teacher that was like the worst case scenario on everybody's tongue in my school. And I'm sure you have had experiences in multiple. I mean, I've had more than one teacher in that setting, right? With that being said, stressed out teachers yell a lot, or struggle a lot to manage the classroom in a calm way. And it's also true that many teachers go into teaching to help kids, and the curriculum is stressful. So I'm not here to knock the educational. I'm not here to knock the profession of teaching in school systems. What I'm here to notice is that when stressed out, adults, can't perform at an effective level that helps all children, and that's true for kids too, right? So your kids, when stressed out, aren't going to be able to meet milestones that are expected of them. And then that becomes an even bigger issue for kids who are neurodivergent thinkers who have to conform to a neurotypical world. So those terms, neurodivergent, means that they're not thinking like a person who doesn't fit that criteria. Neurodivergence can include ADHD, autism, highly sensitive trait, anxiety, depression, intellectual capacities that are different than the norm. So I'm not saying that that I'm just speaking about autistic people or people with ADHD or people who fit the highly sensitive trait, because those all have sensitivities in their experiences. The neurodivergence has all kinds of different categories associated with it. But what I'm talking about is, for you, neurotypical are people without a diagnosable mental health disorder, who don't fit criteria for a mental health disorder, who don't fit criteria for a different way of thinking, and then what we would assume the average Joe thinks. So that's this terminology. I didn't cover that earlier today. Okay, so we want to look at the difference, and the bottom line is that most of the time, the refusal to participate, that leads to an emotional outburst that could be either a no, I won't do it, or no, I can't, all the way to a full-blown meltdown. The quick to quit is due to overwhelm, and the overwhelm can be due to an inability to see the forest for the trees, right? And that's the analysis paralysis, or the frozen experience of this is tricky and I don't know how to break it down, and your question is too broad for me to organize my thoughts, and as a result, I can't. No, I won't. So those are two different experiences that can lead to outright refusal, which is probably why you went down the rabbit hole of figuring out if your kid fit criteria for ADHD or the highly sensitive personality trait in the first place. So with that being said, most kids who have ADHD don't go down the shame spiral And those are the kids that are often misdiagnosed with ADHD because there's a fad called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And I've made a different training on that, alphabet soup stuff, because some researchers on ADHD didn't educate themselves on a trait that's been around for 60 years plus, and instead just came up with their own new name. And so those are highly sensitive kids. I mean, I would bet a lot of my career experience on the fact that kids who have ADHD, who also fit the criteria for this fad of RSD, are actually, in fact, highly sensitive. And then just in terms of the minimal information of what RSD is defined as, compared to the wealth of information of studies of highly sensitive people and highly sensitive children for decades and decades, whereas RSD is a pretty young term. Okay, so we're going to look at attention too. Okay, so we talked a lot about internal motivation and motivation towards interesting tasks compared to wanting to please others, which is more of a highly sensitive trait that's overwhelming. Kids with ADHD are more motivated by interest than they are about whether or not people care if they'll do it, which that individuation is a huge strength. With that being said, noticing the collective community and the collective opinions is also a strength. When either of those, behavior issues become behavior issues and inhibit a child from performing in a way that helps them stay functioning in their communities, that's when it becomes a problem. And that behavior is the symptom of the meltdown cycle. So that's what we were here to address, not like necessarily saying that that caring what other people think is a concern, right? Because empathy is important and collective communication is important, and highly sensitive people are really effective at collecting the community towards a relevant goal. That's the potential of highly sensitive people and the impact that they can make in the world, but only if they have skills and only if they have the ability to regulate their emotions enough, to organize their thoughts enough, to motivate people towards a collective outcome enough to sustain that energy to do that. I have a talk on the potential of your highly sensitive child. You should definitely go check that one out, as I cover that in its entirety more effectively than what we'll cover today, since I'm closing in on an hour here with this topic. So the next piece is that attention, okay? And this is the last one that we're going to talk about, which is probably another one that you are wondering about. Kids with ADHD have more focus on the task at hand right in front of them. When the task is interesting, when the task is, seeming, when they feel capable of completing the task, it feels clear enough to complete, and they understand how to maintain the multiple steps to get to the outcome they're looking for, and they have a way to stay focused if their mind brings up other agenda items. So in adults, ADHD can look like, I'm about to sit down and write a paper, and my desk is messy, and I realize there's a bill on my desk, and I got to pay that bill, or else I'll forget because I've been forgetting for so long, and then I pay the bill, and then I end up on a different website, and then I'm focused on whatever it is that website has. And so one might call that distraction, but it's really just different focus that's singular. Whereas, so the same thing would play out in the in the brain of a child with ADHD. And the singular focus and the short-term focus can be really effective for people who work in career fields with short-term goals. There are plenty of careers with short-term outcomes. But again, you need the skill set to be able to manage your emotions and feel capable. And kids with ADHD often, without those skills, feel incapable, and so they don't succeed, and they struggle. With that being said, statistically speaking, children with a diagnosis of ADHD grow out of it 40% of the time. That means in adulthood, they don't meet the criteria for ADHD. And so here comes my, my point on attention and where kids can get diagnosed with ADHD when in reality they're highly sensitive. And the main concern of their high sensitivity was their inattentiveness that is managed differently in adulthood. And so it's not necessarily a skill gap in the brain's capacity to follow multiple step directions, which is where that distractibility might be named, and organizing step 1 to step 2, step 3, because that's not going to change from childhood to adulthood. That's a skill you need to be explicitly taught, and then repeated over and over again until that system and systems put in place to learn it. And then also like habits need to be built in childhood for adults with ADHD, who true ADHD can operate more effectively in the world, but they also need team members. They need family members who know how to help institute those systems, because systems change throughout your lives, and they need continued self-advocacy skills. So people with ADHD truly fit it. The 60% of that population, who notice those symptoms in adulthood. There are patterns that the whole family needs to be involved in, and an adult with ADHD needs their family members to help them with this. So that doesn't change. Now, people who are likely misdiagnosed with ADHD, who quote unquote grow out of it, this is more likely potential for a missed highly sensitive trait, where those children are viewed as, say, distractible, when in reality they're overwhelmed. They're considering lots of factors, and that is what's leading to the slower presentation, in drawing conclusions, in needing more time on tests, in not being able to complete things in a timely fashion, in missing assignments because the assignments are not done due to fear of poor completion. Again, that analysis paralysis and perfectionism coming into play, which can look like disorganization, because if you don't do the work, a layperson can guess that means you're not motivated, you're just organized enough to remember, right? But highly sensitive kids remember, and they think about it all day, and they feel so frozen they don't get started, and that's a different story. And then lastly is kiddos who are considering so many factors in the world, and that's what's kind of changing their pace. And again, a layperson might see that as a slower pace, a kid who's not able to stay focused, when in reality their brain is moving a mile a minute and they're focused on all the things, and that's why it's hard for them to keep pace with a non-highly sensitive child, whom they're being compared to. Because if they don't have skills to manage that overwhelm and to focus, and just take a step and move beyond the perfectionism, then they will end up in the meltdown cycle or the implosion cycle of I'm the worst, I can't do it, refusal and shut down, which is the other side of the coin of the meltdown cycle. Okay, so now what? Right? Like I said, I wasn't going to give you a master's degree. I could talk about this stuff all day, though. So I'm going to end here with those components, okay, those criteria. And the next piece around this is noticing that as you continue to learn more about the highly sensitive trait, make sure that you check out my show on the highly sensitive trait, understand the 4 components of the highly sensitive trait. We have a whole webpage dedicated to it, Is My Child Highly Sensitive? Where we cover this from different angles as well, and cover more around the mental health industry and the difference between that and how children who are highly sensitive can shift their behavior, which has to be through the parents. And so if you're, by the time you've stuck around, you've been listening, you're clear that your kid fits the highly sensitive trait. They might also fit ADHD, but highly sensitive kids with ADHD need the same approach in terms of shifting their behavior. They just need extra support in the schools. and for homework completion at home. And that requires, all of that requires a strategy. Okay. You need to be able to understand for you as a parent clearly what your perspective of what your kid is capable of. And you need to shift that towards a more strengths-focused approach. And that requires you to understand the personality trait, as well as noticing how you're communicating that keeps your kid in forward momentum, stops them from thinking that they're a bad kid. And that has to come through you. The research is insurmountable. Maybe that's the wrong word. Uncontestable. That's the right word. The research is uncontestable that that parents of highly sensitive children influence their child's behavior more than any other person, professional, etc. And so you can turn this around quickly with the right supports in place, and you need to do that playfully. You need to be able to do that systematically, which means you need to give your kid feedback in a way that doesn't perpetuate shame. And your child needs to hear that feedback consistently in a way that helps them notice how they can continue to make changes that keeps them out of that analysis paralysis. And you have to lead first out of analysis paralysis yourself as a parent, which means if you've gotten down to the end of this video here, this show, however you're watching or listening to me, you're probably pretty certain at this point that you've heard what you need to hear, and then it's time to book a call. You need to have a conversation with a professional, and our team is happy to have that conversation. We're highly skilled at having that conversation and understanding what is driving the force of your kids' major behavior concerns, what's driving the force of your emotional concerns for yourself as parents. And then we'll talk about where you're stuck in all of that. We'll talk about what you are wanting to achieve for your family, what your dream life looks like. And then we'll decide alongside you whether or not you fit the criteria and we fit the criteria to help you get there, whether or not we can help bridge that gap. And we'll teach you that. I'll teach you how that works, and you can get started right away. Because if you've been trying and spinning and Googling and spinning and Googling over and over and over again, so much so to the point where professionals have you second guessing if you're in the right spot, then it's time to talk to people who have been able to break this pattern for hundreds of families. It's time to stop trying to do it on your own. That hasn't worked. And there's no judgment here on that. We have many, many families who have been trying to address this problem for 5, 10, 15, 16 years. Even parents who have adult grown children and then have a second round of kids. I don't know how to say that differently. And they realize, my adult child is struggling and I tried it this way. And now we're going to do things differently with my younger children. And there's no shame in that. There's no judgment in that. Everybody has their own perspectives of what they feel like they need. And again, if you've been listening to long enough, even for today, this is time. It's time to break out of this pattern. And it is something that we've helped families do over and over again. We're happy to do that with you. And if we're not a fit, right? Clearly, I just gave you like an either or training today. We'll tell you that because we are highly specialized in what we do. And it's important that everybody who works with us knows that. So you can trust that our focus is going to be exactly what you need. So we're happy to help you understand and notice and have the clarity on what your family would need if it's not working with us to break out of the pattern. And we'll give you that feedback. We'll tell you exactly what to do. So you end the phone call with a plan and an action step already taken. So how do you do that? You go to meganthompsoncoaching.com/talk. Or if you're parenting a highly sensitive teen, a teen who is isolating, stuck in shutdowns and refusals, then you'll book a call at meganthompsoncoaching.com/teen talk. And we'll have a conversation with you and your teenager so that they can understand how they can find a way and help you, and we can help you stay out of their way too, but also help you help them in a way that's effective, right? So there's that balance that teens want, that independence, but also dependence, and we help teens notice if we're the right fit, how they can trust that process. All right, cool beans. Looking forward to talking to you, and have